They told me grief changes a person. Nobody tells you how it rearranges the furniture in your head. 2 days after we buried Sarah, her laugh still hung in the corners of the kitchen like steam from a pot left on low. I would catch myself reaching for the phone to tell her something small, the sort of nonsense we used to pass back and forth, and then the phone would be a dead weight in my hand, and the silence would rush back in. I'm Tom Anderson, I'm 63, I fixed things for a living. I kept pipes from leaking, windows from rattling, roofs from failing. For 40 years my hands knew how to coax broken things into working again. What Brad didn't know was this: some things can't be fixed with pliers and elbow grease. Some things are kept alive on paper, signatures inked decades ago, the kind of old documents the sheriff's office and the IRS rarely bother to look at unless you force them to. Brad thought the house was his. He'd been saying that for 7 years, like a mantra. He'd been saying it while he drank coffee, while he ignored parking fees at the hospital, while he texted Ashley under fluorescent lights in chemotherapy rooms. He thought a name on a marriage license and a couple of months of living there made him the owner. He'd laughed at me like I was a relic. You're a retired handyman, Tom. You were living rent-free for 7 years. He didn't realize that the last 25 years of my life quietly supported that rent-free life. The disease took Sarah in 8 months, fast, brutal, and entirely unromantic. I spent those months in hospital waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and regret. She would smile for me when she could, and Brad would complain about the cost of parking. "Can't you just visit on weekends?" he once said, as if grief obeyed calendars. He counted his gas money like it had been the real tragedy. That should have been warning enough. But when you're watching someone you love slip away, you bulldoze through warning signs like they're paper targets. After the funeral, I expected us to fold together. 2 people left standing after something enormous had passed. Instead, Brad shut the door on me 2 days later like he was closing a garage. He cornered me in the kitchen where Sarah used to hum as she made tea, and looked at me like I had suddenly become an inconvenience. "Look, Tom," he said without looking up from his phone, "I've been thinking. This house is too big for one person, and honestly, I need a fresh start. You understand, right?" I was still wearing the suit I'd buried my daughter in. I had Sarah's memorial program folded in the inner pocket of my jacket. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, because when a man has spent his life making sure other people's houses don't fall down, he ought not be expected to find new ones on the spot. "There's a nice place on Maple Street, Sunset Manor," he said, "about $1,800 a month. $1,800 a month. My Social Security check was $1,400. At a small pension I had from a construction company, another $600, and the arithmetic chewed up whatever hope was left. $2,500 once you stacked meals and laundry on top of the base rate, I told him. He looked at me with something I had never seen before, the calm of a man who had decided the math made other people disposable. "Well, that's not really my problem anymore," he said. "I mean, you've been living here rent-free for 7 years. Most people would say that's pretty generous. Generous. As if I hadn't paid for utilities when he never looked twice at the bills. As if the mornings I spent patching the gutters and the afternoons I spent rewiring a bathroom were favors. As if the thousands of small things that breathe life into a house were nothing. He had other ways of making his point. That week, I watched him throw Sarah's photo albums into a rented dumpster, like they were scraps of a life he wanted erased. 3 years of school pictures, vacations, birthday cakes, gone in a morning. "What are you doing?" I asked, the words tasting like tin. "Cleaning out junk," he said. "Ashley's moving in. She doesn't want a bunch of old pictures lying around." Ashley, the woman who had the audacity of someone who never had to wait long in a chemo suite, was on the other end of many of Brad's excuses. He'd been texting her during injections and scans and chemotherapy drips. I'd seen the messages sometimes, like a slap against the hospital window. I salvaged what I could from the dumpster, but most of what made Sarah a life, ordinary, messy, quick, was already being driven away. When I confronted him about the pearl necklace, the one that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, he had put it on his nightstand, and with a pawn shop receipt beside it, and said, "Everything in this house belongs to me now. Estate law," he said, as if estate law never had loopholes and cold signatures and people who knew how to read them. By Wednesday, he'd changed the locks on my tool shed. That shed held 40 years of tools, laser levels, professional, grade saws, a Hilti drill that still smelled faintly of drywall dust. Tools I'd bought while running projects, not tools you give up because some man with a suit and a phone tells you to. He called it security. I called it theft by familiarity, and then he handed me a paper, a 30-day notice to vacate printed on letterhead that smelled like a corporate office. 30 days to move the life inside a house into the instability of an assisted living room. 30 days to empty closets full of memories when your bank account says you can't even buy new ones. I called people. I called friends. I called a brother I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Some were sympathetic. Most were practical. No one had room for a 63-year-old man whose pockets were full of grief and whose savings had been chewed down by medical bills. $8,000 in the bank was a thin reed. The math was clear. Homeless before Christmas. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was watching Brad, like some neat finger sweeping across a chalkboard, erase Sarah's life. He had been efficient and cruel in the same breath, as if cruelty were a chore. He'd gone through jewelry boxes, selling what he could, tossing what he couldn't. When I told him the pearls were family heirlooms, he said, "She's not our daughter anymore, Tom. She's just your daughter, and you're just a tenant who's overstayed his welcome." A tenant? That word was supposed to cut, but not as much as the look on his face when he thought the deed was a foregone conclusion. I have kept secrets. That's a softer way to put what I did. I kept things in the closet where time and paper transform into leverage. I kept certain ledgers, filings, and deeds because I'd learned the hard way that people who don't ask questions often pay the price later. For 25 years, I'd been quietly involved in property development, dealing with banks and contracts in a way that made me an expert at the things most men overlooked when they were busy living other people's lives. Margaret Patterson had been my attorney and my friend since the late 90s. We'd worked together on a development deal that was messy and beautiful both. When I called her, she didn't need an explanation. She knew the voice in my throat that meant I was moving a piece on a board. "Can you get everyone together at 2:00 tomorrow?" I asked. Brad, Ashley, Frank Rodriguez, Janet Harrison from First National, and a few neighbors. "I need a will reading, and I need some old paperwork to see daylight." She paused the magical, knowing silence of a woman who had watched me make things happen for years. "That's quite a guest list, Tom. They'll want to hear it," I said. Friday morning Brad pounded on my door like a man who'd been taught to pound things into obedience. "Tom, get out here. We need to talk." He sounded practiced. He'd had practice at demanding things without hearing the reply. He found me in the kitchen, pouring coffee as if pouring it would anchor me. Ashley was in the corner, pajamas creased, looking like someone who'd been dragged into drama they hadn't paid admission for. Brad waved a notification from his phone like a talisman. "What's this about a will reading?" he demanded. "I just got an invitation from your lawyer. Sarah had a will," I said, calm because calm feels like dignity in these moments. "I was asking Margaret to read it. I was married to her for 7 years." He said as if marriage were a legal shield that made silence visible. "I think I'd know if she had a will. There's a lot you don't know, Brad. I replied. He stepped toward me as if height could make up for the absence of facts. Like what, for starters? I said. Have you ever actually seen the deed for this house? Of course he hadn't. He'd never needed to. He'd slept under the roof and unlocked doors with the complacency of men who assume permanence. He'd assumed the world bent to the convenience of his needs. I don't have to prove anything to you, he said, but the confidence was a little thinner. You might be surprised, I said, and I reached into my jacket and drew out an old, worn business card. Anderson Development Group, established 1995. A faint smudge of coffee had leached across it in an afternoon long ago, but the name was resolute. Brad squinted at the card like it was a puzzle piece that didn't belong in his hand. Ashley watched, eyes sharp, sensing the shift like a dog that knows a storm is coming. "You're bluffing?" he said, but the sentence collapsed on itself. I could see the doubt settle in like dust. "Bring identification to Margaret's," I told him. "She'll want to verify legal standing before she discusses certain papers. 200 Patterson and Associates on 17th Street. Don't be late." I could hear Ashley's voice behind me, rising like someone learning the shape of panic. "Brad, what isn't he telling me?" Her voice betrayed a young woman who believed the first story she was given. What Brad hadn't realized, what most people don't realize until their certainty is stripped away, is that the world has accumulated a lot of small, legal crumbs over decades. Deeds, tax filings, business registrations, names on corporate ledgers. I had kept those crumbs not out of malice, but out of prudence. They were the scaffolding of a life I had built before grief and retirement rearranged the plans. That afternoon, Margaret and I sat in her office sifting through files that smelled of old paper and ink. Some of the documents hadn't seen daylight for 25 years. Some of them had signatures that looked like the handwriting of another life, a life that negotiated bank loans and pushed concrete around and took on the sort of risk that pays off in property and sometimes in regret. I watched the sunlight cut across the desk and thought how foolish it was that people think ownership is a feeling rather than a thing you can document and present like evidence in a courtroom. At 1:45, I went back to the house. Brad was a different kind of man, then not smooth and assured, but frantic. He was riffling through a shoebox of papers like a man trying to find a magic talisman to undo the world. "Where's the deed?" he begged. "Where's the actual property deed?" I asked, because now the game was approaching an edge. He looked at me, sweat beading at his hairline. "Ask Margaret," he said, as if other people held the answers he feared to face. "The thing about living quietly is that people stop asking the small questions," I told him. "They look at what they expect to see and miss what's actually there. Like my watch, you saw me wearing it for 7 years and assumed it was nothing. You never noticed what it was." He glanced down at my wrist, where the Rolex Submariner sat like something from another life. He didn't have words for it. He had a fear instead, soft and spreading, the kind of fear that arrives when you realize your certainty was built on someone else's endurance. I stood in the doorway and watched him shuffle papers, his hands trembling slightly. Margaret was going to read more than a will. She was going to read tax filings, property records, and business documents from the late 90s. Documents that, together, told a story Brad had never known he was a part of. He had been the comfortable occupant of a house whose title had been quietly serviced by a man who knew how to keep accounts and signatures in the right places. We were at the precipice of a quiet reckoning. People like Brad confuse presence for possession. They equate the act of sleeping under a roof with having the right to never be challenged. But paper remembers things bodies forget. At 1:58, I stood outside Margaret's office and smoothed my jacket like a man checking the seams before a storm. The sunlight on 17th Street turned the glass of the building into a mirror for a moment, and in it I watched a man 2 days from losing his daughter and 3 days from forcing himself out of a house he had loved, I thought of Sarah's laugh and the small dents in the kitchen table where she had once leaned her elbows. I thought of the jewelry I'd rescued and the albums I'd been able to save. I thought of everything Brad had thought he could throw away. The clock in the lobby hit 2:00, and the world narrowed to a door and a silence on the other side. I could hear my heart like somebody else beating a drum in my chest. I could hear the muted sounds of people's lives behind glass. A car starting, a baby crying, a television laugh track. And then the door opened. Margaret led them in, Brad looking thinner than I'd seen him in years, Ashley clutching a handbag like a life preserver, Frank Rodriguez from next door, already shaking his head with a look that said he'd been expecting fireworks, Janet Harrison from First National, monotonous and precise in a way that made her an ideal witness, and a handful of neighbors who'd watched the slow unspooling from their porches. Brad's eyes were fixed on me like a man who had been told a joke and was waiting for the punchline. He had no idea, not yet, how tidy the law could be when someone had the patience to prepare it. He had no idea what old signatures and ledger entries could do when read aloud. Margaret sat, adjusted her glasses, and opened the first folder. She smiled the kind of small smile that told me she had fun with the theater of the law. "Shall we begin?" she asked, and the room leaned forward. Brad's breath hitched. Ashley's fingers dug into the strap of her purse. Frank cleared his throat. Janet reached for a notepad, like a judge about to make a note of an interesting case. Margaret unfolded the paper, and the room grew very quiet. The next words would change the shape of our house for good. I clenched my fists until the skin went numb. I had done the work. I had kept the receipts and the filings. I had been patient. But patience is a small thing until you press it into a blueprint and call it ownership. She began to read, and then she paused, looking up over her glasses at Brad as if she were savoring the moment. "You might want to sit down, Mr. Wilson," she said. Brad did not sit. He didn't yet know what he had wagered. He didn't know the weight of the paper she had in her hand. The phone in my hand felt heavier than it should have, like a weight made of everything I hadn't said for 25 years. Janet Harrison's name flashed across the screen. First National. The one who'd been my banker back when I still wore suits to ribbon cuttings. Her voice was steady, familiar. "Tom, I got the invitation. Is this about the Sunset Holdings account?" Among other things, I told her. There were accounts and names and structures I'd set up long before I'd swapped city hall meetings for repairing sagging porches. Sunset Holdings wasn't a mystery, just a company name that put a neat line between a man and his assets, so he could work without everyone looking over his shoulder. She asked the practical question, how much should I bring? The full portfolio summary. I said, assets, holdings, transaction history, bring everything. After I hung up, the room seemed to shrink. 3 emails blinked in my inbox: routine reports from property managers, rent rolls from Mile High Real Estate, maintenance updates from Premier Property Management. Little things if you don't know where to look. Payment histories, deposit slips, ledger pages. 7 years Brad had lived in the house and never once wondered why the man he thought was broke received so much mail. Frank's text popped up. "I've got some photos you'll want to see." Frank was the neighbor who'd been a cop long enough to notice small truths. He remembered the ribbon, cutting at Highlands Plaza, remembered the way I'd shaken the mayor's hand and stood under a banner with my company name printed broad and simple. Those were the receipts of a life Brad assumed was gone. At 1:30 I went home to change. Brad was still combing through boxes in the garage like a man trying to find a missing script. Ashley paced the driveway as if the motion would anchor her. "Mom, I don't know what's happening," she said into her phone, voice fraying around the edges. I felt no pleasure in her panic, only an odd, hard clarity that the choices she'd made were beginning to cost her. I changed into the charcoal suit I hadn't worn since the developer dinners. the one that made people look twice and think about the man who owned it, not the man who fixed their pipes. Brad glanced up when I came down the steps, and his face went slack. "Where did you get that suit?" he asked, incredulous. "Same place as the watch," I said. "Same place the tools you locked up came from. Same place a lot of things you never bothered to ask about." Ashley stared at me as if trying to read a book she'd never opened. Then she turned to Brad, all the questions she hadn't asked piling into one frightened breath. "Why does he look like he's going to a business meeting?" she demanded. He had no answer. For the first time, the comfortable certainty of his life creaked. Margaret's office sits on 17th, with a wall of windows that throws the city into the room like a silent jury. The mahogany table could seat an entire neighborhood's grudges, and today it would. I arrived early, and Margaret had arranged her files like a set of surgical instruments, precise and undeniably ready. Frank arrived with a manila folder, thick with photos that made the story plain. Janet Harrison walked in next, navy suit, briefcase in hand, the kind of banker who made numbers sound inevitable. Councilman Richard Barnes, who'd worked with me on public projects for years, slipped in like someone who knows how to read a room. The neighbors arrived in a slow, curious procession. Mrs. Chen, the Morrisons, young Jake Peterson from 2 houses down. Faces that had watched this week's drama with a mixture of disbelief and grievance. Brad and Ashley filed in last, holding onto each other like drowning people holding a plank. Their posture said they expected mercy. Their posture also said they expected the world to tilt back to their favor. They were about to learn they'd misread the horizon. Margaret cleared her throat and began, the kind of voice that calls attention without pleading for it. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Sarah Michelle Anderson Wilson, deceased March 8, 2024. She read Sarah's will with the soft tenderness of someone who has read grief enough to know how to keep it brief. Personal items to friends, a car to charity, a letter to me that spoke of love and apologies and the quiet ways she had tried to protect us both. Then Margaret opened a second folder, and the room changed temperature. "Before we execute Sarah's wishes," she said, "we need to address questions about property ownership that have recently come to light." Brad leaned forward like a dog catching scent. "What kind of questions?" he asked. The room had been waiting for the question. Margaret slid the deed across the table like you slide a charge into a courtroom. "This is the warranty deed for 1002, 147 Maple Grove Drive, recorded in Jefferson County, March 15, 1998. The purchaser was Sunset Holdings, LC. The purchaser's representative was Thomas James Anderson." There was a sound like an intake of breath, the room's collective chest rising. Brad stared at the paper as if someone had told him the sky would fall. He had told himself a story so often he'd started to believe it, that he and Sarah had bought this house in 2017. The paper told a different story, one with dates and signatures and a line that named me. Margaret went on, pulling documents like raw facts from a hat. "Here are 25 years of property tax records, payments made by Sunset Holdings. Total paid more than $900,000. Janet unlatched her briefcase and laid out what bankers love to speak with, numbers and proof. "I have the banking records," she said. "Every payment, every transfer for this property originates from Mr. Anderson's business accounts." Brad's face emptied. "But Sarah said we bought the house," he groped. "You moved into the house," I said, voice even. "Sarah never said you bought it." Ashley stood up so fast her chair scraped. "I need air," she said, like the room had started to close in on all of them. "Sit down," Margaret said, and listened, because that's her work. Let the facts pull the story taut. One by one, the documents unfolded in the light. The ownership structure, the tax payments, the ledgers showing utility transfers and insurance premiums. Janet spread bank statements across the table, like a constellation slowly revealing itself. "Mr. Anderson has paid every expense associated with 1002, 147 Maple Grove Drive since 1998. She said, property, taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, everything. The total investment in this property comes to approximately $4 million, not including the original purchase price. A strange hush settled. The neighbors' murmurs rose, bits of conversations, conjectures, confirmations. Mrs. Chen nodded as if she'd suspected more than she'd had the words to say. Councilman Barnes' expression hardened. He had been part of the public narrative for years, and this was an unexpected footnote. Brad tried to lunge back into the script he preferred, but I improved the house. I put in the deck. I paid for materials. Frank did what policemen always do, fill silence with an evidentiary tape. He reached into his folder and laid out photos of me in the field. Ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies, the city plaque that named me for community development. He produced receipts and a photograph of us loading lumber into a truck. I helped him load that lumber, he said. $400 worth from Home Depot. Tom paid cash. Those are the small details that turn a murmur into a verdict. You could see Brad's mind racing for an escape hatch, an explanation that made him less culpable, but there was simply no place to fit one. Ashley's face had gone waxen. Her hands fluttered against the strap of her bag. This can't be right, she said. Her voice cracked. Panic tastes like loss too, Mr. Wilson. Margaret said, and her voice was now clinical and precise. You served Mr. Anderson a 30-day notice to vacate, and you changed the locks on property that is legally owned by Mr. Anderson. You disposed of personal belongings without permission. You have been occupying this property for 7 years without paying taxes or fees in your name. Brad's protest was small. I live there. I have rights. You have no legal claim to ownership. Janet replied with the calm rage of a banker who has seen privilege cloaked in ignorance. Squatters' rights in Colorado require history, open, notorious occupation for 18 years and payment of taxes. You meet none of these conditions. At that moment, Margaret slid the crisp paper across the table, the document that made the room tilt. A 30-day notice to quit and surrender possession served by the legal owner. She clicked it across toward Brad as if it were a verdict. Congratulations, Mr. Wilson, she said in that voice that gets remembered. You are being evicted. The room detonated. Ashley began hyperventilating into a paper bag like someone in a bad movie. Brad looked down at the eviction notice as though it might combust and take him with it. Neighbors whispered, some in vindication, some in shock. Mrs. Chen's small voice cut clear. I knew something was off about that boy. And I sat there, my hands folded, feeling something complicated and raw settle in my chest. It wasn't glee. It was the bleak, clean edge of a thing done. Centuries of being patient had hardened into a single legal motion. 25 years of quiet bookkeeping had finally called the household's bluff. Order, Margaret said, and she actually tapped a small gavel she kept for rhetorical purposes. We are not finished here. Brad's shoulders shook. This can't be legal. He whispered, I live here. I have rights. You've been living here, Mr. Wilson, but not as an owner. Margaret said, you have occupied a property owned and maintained by Mr. Anderson. The records show that conclusively. Janet had one final folder, and she opened it slowly, like someone exposing a photograph. I have complete financial histories for the past 25 years, she said. She spread the bank statements out across the mahogany like a map to a treasure chest no one had wanted to loot. Figures, line items, the quiet arithmetic of a man who had been funding a life without flaunting it. The total now accounted for is approximately $4 million in payments, improvements, and expenses. Brad's hands were small fists. He tried one last defense. I put in a new deck. I did the work. Frank's voice cut through. I helped you load the lumber. I saw the money change hands. Tom paid cash. That was the pivot. The room shifted its gaze from being taught a lesson to watching an unraveling. Brad's mouth moved, but no coherent words came out. Ashley's knuckles were white around the strap of her purse. She looked at me like she was finally seeing what she had signed onto when she moved in. "And what about the items you disposed of?" Margaret asked, her tone even but edged like a scalpel. Brad could only look at the table. He could see in the spread of papers not only his folly but his exposure. Someone in the room might have been willing to hand him a lifeline in another story. Not here, not now. That's when the air changed again. I had expected the chaos. I'd rehearsed for it. What I hadn't expected was how small he would seem reduced by the thing he thought he'd own. He had been the man who barked orders in the kitchen, who decided which memories stayed and which were tossed. Now he looked like a man waiting to be ordered out. Then he did something that broke the measured, legal atmosphere into real life. His eyes moved to the bank statements. He snarled something about fraud and rights and lawyers. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping like an accusation, and reached out, not for a paper or a page, but for a sound. He made for the door, desperate to find the next act of what's left to lose. Margaret wasn't done. She pulled a final folder toward her, and the room held its breath. "Before we conclude," she said, "there is one more document that will be relevant to the current claim." Brad's jaw tightened. Ashley clung to him like a child to a parent. Councilman Barnes straightened as if preparing to witness a rupture in the civic order. Frank's face was the quiet delight of a man who'd expected this catharsis from the beginning. The folder sat there on the table. Its edges were crisp. The light caught the corner like a lighthouse beam. Margaret slid it toward me first, giving me the choice of whether to see the contents now or let them speak for themselves. I stared at the folder for a long second, remembering hospital rooms and late night calls and the small kindnesses that pile up into a life. The folder contained signatures that would make the eviction stick. But it contained other things, 2 letters, corporate filings, and a curated trail that wouldn't just evict a man. It would expose him. I put my hand on the folder and felt the pulse in my wrist, slow and steady. The table was full of people who had watched this week, and each of them now leaned forward to see the end of a story they had been following. Brad rose, pale and dangerous. He had one last card to play, a phone clenched in his fist and a mouth full of threats. He looked around the room, not for mercy, but for allies. None came. "Don't even think about calling the police." Margaret said softly, "We've already made that call." He didn't listen. He lunged for the folder. Glass on the office wall sang, a sound like a thin bell. Chairs scraped. There was a scuffle, one that began with desperation and might end in something none of us had planned. Papers fanned out like startled birds. Someone shouted. Ashley screamed, and then everything went white. The room had hardly finished yelling when Margaret folded her hands and began to lay out facts like a surgeon closing an incision. Precise, deliberate, impossible to misread. "The hot water heater," she said, "was installed by Morrison and Sons Plumbing. Check came from Mr. Anderson's account. We have the receipt." Her finger touched a ledger entry with the gentle authority of someone who knows where all the bodies of evidence are buried. "The new windows?" she asked, and before Margaret could finish, she turned a page and spoke with the kind of quiet that makes a courtroom lean in. "Anderson Glass Company, $80,000, paid by Sunset Holdings LLC on September 15th, 2019. Ashley rocked in her chair like a small boat in a storm. "This isn't happening," she murmured as if the world might reconsider. "Oh, it's happening," Councilman Barnes said, without cruelty, simply a man watching the scales tip and noting the weight. "People always want to know why you didn't tell," Margaret asked it the cleanest way, eyes on me like she'd known the answer the instant I'd set the first paper aside 25 years ago. "Sarah asked me not to," I said. "I didn't make a speech. I didn't frame it like a strategy. It was simpler and more private than that." She was embarrassed that Brad couldn't afford the mortgage. She came to me in 2017 crying because the house was about to go into foreclosure. She begged me to buy it and let them live there. It would have killed him to know. The sound of that truth landed like a physical thing against Brad. his face emptied of color. For so long he'd been the actor, and the role had fit. Now the script had pages he'd never read. Margaret pulled a folded letter from a file and held it like an heirloom. "This is a letter from Sarah written in 2017, she said. "Would you like me to read it?" "Yes," I said. My voice didn't shake, but my throat did. I needed the moment to be precise because precision is the opposite of the ragged, small comforts grief tends to offer. Margaret read slowly, the cadence of the words carving the room into two halves, what had been hidden and what had been kept. "Dad?" She read, voice steady. "I know this arrangement is going to be hard on you, but I need you to know how grateful I am. Brad has such pride about being the provider, and if he knew the truth about our finances, it would destroy him. He works so hard, but his salary just isn't enough for the life we want together. I promise someday I'll find a way to pay you back for everything. I love you so much for making this possible. Please don't ever let Brad know. It would kill him to realize he's been living on charity. Love always, Sarah." The room went flat as a hand laid on a table. I could hear the air conditioner hum, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Brad began to cry in a way I hadn't seen from him. No bravado, no clipped anger, just the honest release of a man whose house of cards had been knocked by a single, loving hand. He made a sound that was part apology and part accusation. "She protected me for 7 years," I said quietly. "Kept you from the truth. You took that kindness and threw it away." Margaret's voice sharpened. "And how did you repay that kindness, Mr. Wilson?" she asked. Ashley stood suddenly, her chair clattering. "I can't do this," she said, and the decision seemed made the moment it left her lips. She grabbed her purse, paused just long enough to avoid looking at Brad, and left. We watched her go through the window, a woman in a car who'd chosen the wrong side in a fight she hadn't fully understood until the evidence was placed on a table. Brad clung to the table as if it could steady him. He asked the practical question, small now. "What happens now?" "You have 30 days to vacate," Margaret said. The phrasing was clinical, like the administration of medicine that takes away pain but leaves the wound exposed. "All personal belongings must be removed. Anything left will be abandoned property. I have no place to go," he said, the question not rhetorical this time. "That's not really my problem anymore, is it?" I repeated his earlier cruelty back to him, not to gloat, but to let him hear the echo of his own words. "Most people would call 7 years of free housing pretty generous." Janet had assembled receipts while Margaret read letters, the ledger of a life that had fed itself quietly into the maintenance of a home. Furniture, $43,000. Electronics, $12,000. Art and decorations, $8,000. All paid by shell companies I'd set up years ago so Sarah could keep the illusion she needed to protect him. The neighbors murmured like an audience getting comfortable with the truth. Frank laid out photos of me working with the community, fixing fences, organizing Christmas lights, running snowblowers for elderly folks who could no longer do it themselves. Each picture was a small truth that ran contrary to Brad's story. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street and had probably seen more than she'd said, leaned forward. "We assumed right, you assumed wrong," she said plainly, the words like a small apology and a verdict rolled into one. When Margaret called the meeting to a close, people offered handshakes and awkward condolences. Brad remained, eyes fixed on the eviction notice like it had become a riddling map. 7 years, he whispered, repeating it like a prayer or a curse. "I lived there for 7 years, yes," I said, buttoning my coat. 7 years of kindness you mistook for weakness. My voice carried none of the sharpness inside me. That cruelty belonged to him, built on the assumption he could take anything from a quiet man because the man would not make a scene. On the drive back, the house looked the way it had for most of my life, familiar in a way that made my chest unclench. For the first time in a week, I was going home to my own property, a phrase that felt both foreign and right in equal measure. Brad didn't ride with me. He'd taken Ashley's car and left, a man carrying the aftermath of choices. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see the chaos he'd already made. Garbage bags heaped near the door, chairs pushed up against walls as if speed could outpace humiliation. Margaret called while I was still on the porch. "Tom," she said, "he'll fight this. Let him try," I said. The quietness in my voice surprised me. I had expected the anger to return like a blaze, but it didn't. Exhaustion had a different texture, flat, surgical. "Margaret, read me the plan." A temporary protective order would be filed Monday morning to keep Brad off the property, and to stop him from removing or destroying items without court supervision. She planned a possession action, immediate, backed by the records we'd shown today. An emergency hearing with Judge Martinez, one who owed me a favor from the Henderson case, would be arranged. If Brad didn't respond in the time frame, eviction could happen immediately. "How long will this take?" I asked, the small practicalness of it returning. "Emergency hearing Monday," she said. "We'll serve him with papers tomorrow. If he doesn't respond, we move forward. I'll be filing the restraining order first thing." The afternoon felt like the gathering after a battle, quiet, a little stunned, and strangely clean. I left Brad with a faint mercy I hadn't thought I'd offer. "You can stay until Monday morning," I told him when he came in clutching a bottle of whiskey and looking 10 years older. He had the gall to ask for 5 days, and I granted him 3. "Guest room," I said. "You don't touch anything else. No more packing. No more throwing away memories. This is my home, and you will treat it with respect." He nodded like a man who'd been given a reprieve he did not deserve. "Thank you," he said, the word wholly without pride. "I'm sorry for everything. That night I went upstairs to Sarah's room for the first time without someone trying to redefine my worth. I sat on the chair by the window and allowed myself to grieve in the way grief meant to be allowed without interruption, without someone telling me to be practical, without someone playing accountant with loss. The house felt like it belonged to its own history again. The heirlooms I had managed to rescue, a few photographs, the pearl necklace I'd recovered before it vanished into a pawnbroker's ledger, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, these small things were the connective tissue of a life I hadn't finished living. Sunday, the neighborhood started to reshape itself. Mrs. Chen brought over a casserole and an apology shaped between 2 spoons. "Tom," she said, nervous and earnest, "Harold and I have been talking. We owe you an apology." "For what?" I asked. "For not saying something sooner," she said. "We knew Brad was treating you poorly but thought it was family business." "Family business is a funny thing," I said. "Sometimes it's private pain. Sometimes it's someone else's shame. It's not right," she said, and both of us could feel the world tilting back to a human scale. Others who'd kept their distance over the week started showing up in small ways. Frank trimmed the hedges with me for the afternoon. The Morrisons brought over garden tools we'd used on shared projects. Jake from 2 houses down came by and mowed the lawn without asking, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Support showed up not as a spectacle, but like a network. Neighbors pulling weight because they remembered the man who had cleared their driveways and fixed their roofs. Then Monday came. Margaret dropped by my kitchen before she went to the courthouse. She had the temporary protective order ready. "He'll be served this morning," she said. "There will be an emergency hearing at 10. Don't be surprised if he brings theatrics. People like him respond to loud noises. We'll keep it clinical. Paperwork, signatures, a judge." Courtroom mornings are always a blend of the everyday and the theatrical. Men in shirts who will be judges for 1 hour in a small courtroom, and ordinary citizens who find their lives turned in evidence. The sheriff's deputy served Brad while he slept in the guest room. He woke with a start and a paper in his hand, and for a moment I thought of the sleep you have when you're untroubled by consequences. That sleep was over. At 10, Judge Martinez presided. Margaret stood, brought the stacks of documents we'd laid on the mahogany table into the courtroom and laid them out like offerings. The deed, the tax records, bank statements, Sarah's letter, invoices for windows and the hot water heater, the receipts for furniture and electronics. Brad squinted at the evidence like a man trying to see the future through thick glass. This court acknowledges the documentation presented by Mr. Anderson and M.S. Patterson. Judge Martinez said, voice crisp. A temporary protection order will be granted to prevent Mr. Wilson from entering the premises or removing any property without court supervision. We will hold a follow-up hearing in 90 days. Address possession if necessary. Brad's face twisted, a raw thing. Fear, anger, humiliation braided together. He mouthed words, but the judge called the proceedings. The law moved like a machine that had been oiled for years. It was merciless in the way he'd been merciless for a week. He left the courtroom that afternoon under a cloud. I didn't enjoy watching him carry, but I also didn't pity him in the way some expect people to be pitied. Pity implies power over someone who's fallen. I felt only a clean resignation. The slow truth, for once, had found a place to land. Neighbors began to visit in that slow, natural way people who want to rebuild things do. Someone fixed the squeal on the back gate. Another neighbor brought over mason jars for preserves and told me about how they'd once seen me hanging lights at Christmas with a grin. These small acts are the stitches that repair a week's worth of public humiliation. Yet even with the law on my side, there remained a small, private ache that paperwork could not fill. Sarah's absence was a constant shape at the edge of every room, a piece of the house that will never be retaken by law. Winning the arguments about title and receipts didn't bring her back. It simply made sure that her memories had a place to stay. There was a final act that none of us predicted. A week after the hearing, as the frost loosened from the early mornings and the city started to breathe a little easier, I received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph showed Sarah, younger, at a community fundraiser, laughing and holding a certificate for organizing volunteers. Her eyes were the same, so was the set of her mouth when she was mid-laugh, that particular crinkle I had loved my whole life. The note was brief. It read, "Thank you for everything, S." I folded the photograph and let it sit on my palm for a long time. The paper felt like a small, private justice, not the law's, but the one that matters most, the quiet confirmation that the sacrifices we make for the people we love are seen even when they are hidden. What happens to Brad? He found a place to stay with his mother for a while. He traded phones and suit jackets the week after, and took down his social media like a man trying to rearrange evidence. There were rumors he appealed. People have long memories for small defeats, and longer ones for the kinds of reputations that take a week to ruin. If he decides to fight, the courts will tell us how that plays out. For now, what matters is the house, the plumbing that does not leak, the windows that do not rattle, the photographs that sit on the shelf where children once left stray crayons. They came with casseroles and folding chairs, and the sort of awkward apologies neighbors keep in their pockets until the right moment. Mrs. Chen handed me a dish with both hands. The gesture itself felt like a small ceremony. "If we'd known you owned the house," she started, voice low and honest, and then stopped. You could see the work it did on her, the recognition that keeping quiet had been easier than asking hard questions. "What would you have done?" I asked, because sometimes the polite thing is a question. It's not our responsibility to police other people's relationships, she said after a breath. Maybe not, but we could have been better neighbors, better friends, and with that, she handed me the casserole, the whole street condensed into warm, unexpected comfort. By 6, the yard was full. Frank rolled up in his apron and set his barbecue like a general arriving to his post. The Morrisons brought wine. Jake Peterson, young and awkwardly gifted, tuned his guitar and sat beneath the sycamore, his voice a kind of easy companion to children chasing one another in the grass. For years the house had been a tense battleground. Tonight, under string lights, it felt ordinary and celebratory in the way home finally does when the story that lived behind closed doors is told. In full, people wanted answers. Jake asked me plainly during a lull when the sun had softened, "How did you keep it secret for so long?" "Practice," I said, and the answer landed somewhere between a joke and a confession. "And a daughter who asked me to keep it." I thought of Sarah then, her stubborn generosity, and how she'd traded her pride to protect Brad's. Anger had been part of my reaction, certainly, but mostly I'd been sad. Sad that someone needed a veil of illusion to sleep at night. Sad that Sarah thought shame would be kinder than honesty. Mrs. Chen overheard and asked what would become of Brad. "He'll figure something out," I said, because I wanted to believe it. "He's not a bad man, he's a weak one. Maybe this will push him to build something honest." "How can losing everything be good?" someone asked. "Because everything he thought he had was built on a lie," I answered. "Now he has a chance to build something real." Word spread faster than any of us expected. Margaret called Saturday morning, practical and brisk, reporters at her door. Janet at the bank rang with the industry's version of gossip. "They're calling you the secret millionaire next door." Councilman Barnes called about consulting for affordable housing. People often see what they need to see in tales like this. A comeback narrative, a moral tidy and satisfying. By Sunday evening, a reporter from Channel 7 rang my landline. "We'd like to do a story," she said, "about hidden generosity, about family and financial abuse." I hesitated. My grief was still a fresh thing. The idea of lights and microphones made it rower. "Not television," I said finally. "Maybe a print interview. If it helps other families who are being taken advantage of, that's worth it." Monday morning arrived with a gray sky and a slow, methodical cold that felt like the world exhaling after a week of strain. Brad moved slowly that morning, stuffing clothes into garbage bags and carrying them to a rental truck, with the careful deliberation of someone who had watched a life's little luxuries dissolve. At 9, Margaret's process server arrived and presented the final paperwork. Brad signed without argument. The anger had gone out of him, replaced by a shape of defeat I couldn't mistake for humility. Before he left, he held out a small box. Inside was a ring, the promise ring I'd given Sarah on her 16th birthday, the one she'd worn on her right hand when the world still felt ductile enough to be reshaped with promises. "She asked me to make sure you got it back," Brad said, voice low. "Said it was more important than the wedding ring." I felt something break and reknit itself in the same second. Tears came then, soft and private. "Thank you," I said, meaning every small syllable. He tipped his chin once. "For what it's worth, Tom, you raised an amazing daughter. She loved you more than anything." Then he got in his truck and drove off. The house felt empty for a beat, not in the way of loss, but in a way that let me breathe. I was alone in the place I owned, surrounded by things I had paid for and people who now knew the truth. That steadiness meant more than any headline. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood stitched itself back together. Mrs. Chen dropped by with more casseroles. Frank helped clear a dead limb from the yard. The Morrisons invited me over for tea. Small, neighborly repairs that have nothing to do with law and everything to do with community. The roof, the gutters, the gate, all the ordinary tasks that make a house a home, became shared labor again, as if the neighborhood was making restitution in the only currency it had. I learned things about people, too. Some were embarrassed they'd kept silent. Others admitted they'd suspected something, but never wanted to poke at someone else's family. There's a dignity to being the one who steps forward and says, "I was wrong," and I respected those who could say it. 3 months later, in a quieter rhythm of recovery, Brad knocked at my door. He looked thinner, tired, but not hollowed the way he had a few months prior. He stood on the porch with that tentative posture of a man who'd been learning the contours of humility. "Tom," he said simply, "you can ring the bell," I said, "but you can't come in without an invitation." He understood the boundary. For a few minutes there was silence, the sort of silence that held potential for something new. "I'm living in Grand Junction with my mom," he said. "Got a job at a smaller insurance firm. Less money, but honest work. I'm seeing a therapist. She helped me understand why I always needed to feel important. I was scared of being seen as a failure. So I leaned on other people's success instead of creating my own." There was a sincerity to him that hadn't been there before. Not perfect, not absolution, just effort. I listened. "Could you have handled the truth 7 years ago?" he asked honestly. "Probably not," I admitted. "People grow, people change. Maybe this is where yours starts." We stood there as Margaret arrived for our weekly planning meeting, a briefcase and a purpose. She'd convinced me to come out of retirement and consult for a new affordable housing project the city had pushed to the top of its agenda. "You'll like the design team," she said, nodding at the papers peeking from her case. Brad lingered, then asked something that sounded smaller than it was grand. "Would it be okay if I sent a card on Sarah's birthday, just to let you know I'm thinking about her?" I studied his face. The old arrogance had gone. It had been replaced by something quieter. "That would be fine," I said, "but don't expect a reply. Forgiveness is a process, not an event." He nodded, grateful for a sliver of grace. "Thank you," he said. After he left, Margaret and I stepped inside and spread architectural plans on my dining table. The same room that had seen arguments and consolations, and now a new kind of planning. "How do you feel about it?" she asked, noticing my thoughtful mood. "Better than I expected," I said. "He seems like he's learning." "Do you think you'll ever have a relationship with him again?" she asked. "Maybe," I said slowly, "but it would have to be different. Honest instead of convenient, respectful instead of entitled, boundaries instead of exploitation." She smiled, that practical joy of someone watching a good principle find purchase. "Those sound like decent foundations," she said. The months that followed were a quiet work of reclamation. I reconnected with old associates in the development business, resumed attendance at city planning meetings, and agreed to chair a steering committee for that affordable housing initiative. I dated a little, too, a warm, considerate woman named Carol, who liked my cooking and asked about my past without making it a confession. We visited mountain properties and argued about wallpaper, and learned each other's rhythms the way two people make space for one another. I also did the things that mattered in private. I established a scholarship fund in Sarah's name for students interested in business and development. I donated to the Cancer Research Center that had fought so hard for her. I kept the photographs and the few heirlooms that could carry her into the future, and let other things be replaced by the natural accumulation of a life lived forward. The house felt lighter not because the grief diminished, but because the weight of its management was no longer shared by a liar. Brad's life settled into a quieter shape. He moved in with his mom for a while, then rented a small place near a bus line. He took calls less and listened more. Sometimes he'd drop a card on Sarah's birthday, and sometimes he wouldn't. Whether we ever rebuilt a full relationship remained unknown. Forgiveness, I'd learned, is seldom a single act. It's a series of small decisions, repeated until the memory of harm softens. There was one small, private confirmation that felt like mercy. A week after the courthouse hearing, a plain envelope arrived with a single photograph and a short note. A picture of Sarah Younger, laughing at a volunteer picnic. A typed line on the back, "Thank you for everything, yes. I keep it in my desk drawer. It is not evidence the law can use, nor is it a headline. It's a quiet, private thing. The knowledge that what I did to honor her wishes was known and appreciated. If you've been sitting with something similar, an adult child who takes advantage of your generosity, relationships that confuse kindness with weakness, remember 2 practical things. First, paperwork remembers. Keep receipts, names, and documents in order. It is the slowest, most patient form of defense. Second, community matters. The neighbors who showed up with casseroles and mowed lawns didn't do it because they wanted to see someone fall. They did it because they remembered the small kindnesses I had given them over the years. People will show up if you let them. If you stayed with this whole story, if Sarah's face is still in your mind and the ache of the ending lingers, I want to ask something small. Hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps me tell more of these real life stories that are messy, painful, and sometimes oddly hopeful. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read them all. There are other files in the drawer, small sketches of cases, receipts for moments that mattered, and letters that never made it to court. If you want them, say more stories, and I'll bring them out. If you want to know more about what happened to Brad after the appeal, or about the people who testified at the hearing, ask and I'll pull the receipts and the photographs. But for now, I'll close with what mattered most. Kindness should never require you to sacrifice your dignity. Protect your boundaries. Keep your paperwork. Love hard, but not at the expense of your peace. If you're still watching, subscribe for more real life revenge stories that hit deep, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment.